So the last thing I want to talk about is the difference or the relationship between elasticity and the incidence of the tax. And it turns out that the relative elasticities of supply and demand determine whether the buyers or sellers pay or incur a higher burden of the tax. So starting with where supply is more elastic than demand. So supply responds more to changes in price than demand does. So if there is a $4 per unit tax imposed on buyers, then the new demand curve will look like this. Oops. So there's a $4 wedge between the price that the buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. So here's our new equilibrium. Obviously, we have a reduction in quantity. And here is the price that buyers pay. Oh, so let me jot in. So this is our equilibrium price. This is the price that buyers pay. And this is the price that sellers receive. And as you can see, the tax burden for the buyers is much bigger than the tax burden for sellers. So, and the reason is very simple. Because supply is relatively elastic, it is easier for sellers to leave the market. So if sellers' supply is very responsive to changes in price, then a tax will cause a lot more sellers to leave. And so the buyers will share a bigger burden. So now let's think about the case where we have a relatively elastic demand, where demand is very responsive to changes in price and supply isn't. So again, let's think about a $4 tax incurred on buyers. So the new supply demand curve will go through this point here, and it'll look like this. Let me draw that again. We know the original equilibrium price is right here. So equilibrium price is right there. So that's our no tax equilibrium. We know that after the tax, this is how much of the good is going to be sold. We know the price that sellers receive is right here. And the price that buyers pay is right here. And again, you can see that the burden of tax is borne more heavily on the sellers and the buyers. The sellers see a much larger reduction in the price that they receive than the buyers see an increase in the price that they pay. So it's easier. for buyers to leave the market than it is for sellers. And so sellers bear most of the tax burden. And that's it. So in this chapter, we talked about 3 different types of government intervention in markets. We talked about price ceilings, price floors, and taxes. We talked about what happens to supply and demand and the equilibrium outcome in the face of all of these different interventions. And we saw that for price controls, there's a difference between the quantity that households buy, or the quantity that buyers buy, and the quantity that sellers sell. And for taxes, we see a difference in the price paid. So, we also saw how the elasticity, or the relative elasticities of supply and demand, affect the incidence, or the burden paid by buyers and sellers. Now, in the subsequent chapter, we're going to talk about what are the effects in terms of welfare. Why is this a problem? Where do we see taxes causing inefficiency? And that's the next step.